Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. On an evening of unpromising drizzle and blown lamps, when London's streets were coated with the reflections of their own dimness, a single visitor was led into the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. He entered with the hesitant step of a guy who has gone too far on a whim and discovered the pavement ended under him. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his long limbs around the settee and his eyes half hooded in that bored receptiveness that always preceded a case of interest. Watson's newspaper rustled down on his knee. The gentleman introduced himself as Mr. Percival Mullet, an unlikely name for an impresario, but that is exactly what he was, manager of the Aldwych Pavilion and, as he was quick to point out, recently an associate of a violinist whose nickname had drawn fashionable West End listeners into unfashionable East End streets. The newspapers dubbed him the silent violinist of Whitechapel. He was Romanian by birth, Viennese by training, and according to Mr. Mullet, ascetic, enigmatic, and completely free of vices except a compulsive obsession with punctuality. Mullet told us his genuine name was Victor Petrescu. Holmes, whose disdain of musical embellishment did not reduce his appreciation of musical reality, angled his head. The flames removed copper from his eyes. The manager's child gloves, yellowed by the night, were clamped around his hat's brim. In his agitation, I noticed a faint dusting of white on his right forefinger, which I assumed was rosin, despite the fact that managers do not use rosin. Holmes observed it too and grinned without saying anything. Mr. Mullet began, and his words flowed in a hesitant rush, overpowering any attempts at calmness. "Mr. Holmes, there has been a death at my theatre. At least the police say it was a natural death, though there is nothing natural about the manner in which it occurred. It has, if you'll excuse the expression, unstrung me." "Pray be seated, Mr. Mullet," Holmes said quietly. "The fire does not interrogate, but it does warm you. Dr. Watson will take note of anything that requires medical conscience. Now, who is dead and what is unnatural?" The man said, "Victor Petrescu," and the name seemed to dull the room even more. "The silent violinist. He played tonight, or rather, he did not play, which is the heart of it. And then afterward, we found him in his dressing room and the door was bolted and—" He swallowed. "Forgive me, I am not equal to a physician's calm." Holmes sat forward. "You said he didn't play. However, the broadcast proclaimed Wieniawski's second. The gallery would have known if a keyboard was substituted for a violin." "What do you mean he did not play?" Mr. Mullet licked his lips, and his small, eager, entrepreneurial eyes went to Watson, as if a doctor could make the story more plausible. "Gentlemen," the hall was completely full. The stage lights were dimmed to his favored color, a cool blue that highlighted his instrument against the velvet drape. He moved forward to the footlights alone, as was his plan for the first 5 bars. He drew the bow. We witnessed the stroke. The audience witnessed it. The boy on the gas lever said he felt the rosin in his throat. And still nothing, not a sound, not even a whisper of string. It was as if every ear in the house had been crammed during the concert. The orchestra arrived at the designated time. Poor fools, they mistook his quiet for bravura hesitation, and when they did, it was just noise on nothing. He kept his bow going, gentlemen. He delivered the entire cadenza in pantomime, with the gravitas of a priest at a wordless mass. And still nothing. Watson couldn't help himself. "A broken soundpost?" "No," answered Mullet too hastily. "The instrument talked during the rehearsal, not 30 minutes earlier." Warm and resonant, he searched the hall for pockets of dead air. He was meticulous. "It sung then." And then, just before he went on, I heard him behind the curtain, just a series of scales. It sung then too. However, no sound was heard during the performance. Holmes's fingers steepled. And afterward. After that he bowed in silence, which became into confusion and then panic. He left without delay. He was a serious man who didn't take offense like others. I went around the corridor to his room, demanding, no begging, an explanation. Perhaps the bridge slid on the first stroke, and he continued rather than exposing the instrument's flaw. Perhaps— The impresario's voice grew smaller. "The door was fastened from within. I called to him. There was no response. We summoned a carpenter. Police were summoned. The bolt was pushed. He was sitting in the small chair beside his mirror, as if relaxing, with his instrument across his knees and his bow in his hand. His eyes were closed, and his countenance was one of calm I had never seen in my life. He had died, gentlemen. Natural causes, Holmes said without inquiry. So Inspector Lestrade calls it. A failure of the heart, say they, brought on by exertion. But I swear to you, he was as strong as a hickory bow. And what heart breaks at the exact moment that a violin ceases to exist? That is the unnatural aspect of it, Mr. Holmes. The silence killed him or something like that. Watson, who has served as a physician to warriors and in times of sorrow, considers himself a man of science. Even he felt the tickle of an idea, that silence may be used as an instrument. He disregarded it more vehemently because it appealed. Holmes stood and proceeded to the mantel, where his chemical apparatus had once again begun to colonize the marble. He did not touch anything, but peered into the flames as if the coal's red architecture hid a staff notation only he could read. "Tell me, Mr. Mullet," he finally asked, "you mentioned rehearsal within the last half hour. Who was present?" "The entire orchestra, their conductor, Mr. Itzhak Bloom, myself, the gas boy, the stage carpenter, and Miss Ada Vale, our mezzo, who performed on the second half of the bill. There was also a young man, one of those East End youths who cling themselves to talent as remoras to a shark, who carried Petrescu's case. I don't know his name. Petrescu referred to him as Bayat, which is Romanian for boy. Was Mr. Petrescu's hearing normal? He had a habit of caressing his left ear before speaking, as if to block out the rest of the world. But he listened. Oh, he overheard everything. He could embarrass a bassoon with a glare. "And you, sir," Holmes continued, turning, "keep the rosin in your pocket." The impresario began, looked at his finger and smiled with embarrassed pride. "Mr. Holmes, I used to stage manage at the Surrey. In a pinch, I've tightened a string and created a scene in the same breath. Old habits." Holmes bowed his head as if a minor point had been granted in an argument no one else watched. He pulled on his dressing gown cord until it was taut between his fingers. The door was bolted. "What about the windows?" "Latched from the inside, with putty on one side where the sash rattles." The inspector remarked on it. "Nothing is disturbed. There is no fragrance except for rosin and lamp oil. No note." Mr. Mullet paused. "Only if you will not laugh, sir, only a page of manuscript on the dressing table. Staves are ruled with violet ink. There were no notes drawn, only rests, bar after bar of total quiet." He'd penned his silence. Watson felt his skin gather cold. Holmes's nostril raised slightly. He created the impression of a whippet scenting a rabbit's shadow rather than a rabbit itself. And the time? From the curtain to the carpenter's pry, 20 minutes, no more. The boy ran like a hare. Holmes nodded once. "We will go to your pavilion right away. The drizzle will not injure a dead man, and it has never hurt a truth that was waterproofed at birth." Mr. Mullet attempted to rise, but Holmes's hand hovered in the air, halting him with the grace of a conductor's two-beat. "One last trifle," Holmes remarked. "Mr. Petrescu was called the silent violinist because he favored pauses or because he favored Whitechapel?" "Because of a story in the penny press," Mullet responded, appearing disappointed. "They wrote that he once took a whole movement and played it non sonante, with the bow barely touching, simply a ghost of sound, so that the crowd pushed forward as one body and forgot to breathe." This was not true. He had a flair for pianissimo, but he was not a trickster. He despised tricks. Holmes grinned in that thin, inward expression Watson had learned to interpret as real interest. "Then either someone has paid him a gross compliment after his death," replied the man softly, "or someone has given him a trick he detested." He reaches for his coat. The violin case from his own experiments, which had been empty for years, sparkled briefly in the corner. Watson took the cap and bag. When Mrs. Hudson opened the door, the rain fell like a thread from a tattered sky, and the city's breath steamed from the cellar grills. In that moment, 10 minutes later, the Aldwych Pavilion stood like a lantern engulfed by fog. A constable's truncheon tapped an idle rhythm on the jamb at its stage door, and somewhere within, beyond the stapled flats and dusty backcloths, there was a room where an artist had written nothing down and died as a result. Watson, who was aware of his friend's moods, noticed a strange brilliance in Holmes, the scintillation that occurs when a paradox brushes against the skin of logic. The constable's nod, the draught of gaslit corridors, the scent of grease paint and damp rope all vanished inside the theatre. And when their footsteps shattered a mansion that had just admitted to being soundproof, the case of the silent violinist of Whitechapel started. The stage entrance led us into a hallway of raw brick and iron brackets, where coils of hemp hung like molting serpents, and the house's breath came warm and stale from above. A cop touched his helmet beyond him. Inspector Lestrade stood with the look of someone who has already explained everything, and despised the world for not agreeing. He greeted Holmes and me politely, and led us down a corridor where the paint had blistered from 1,000 cloudy winters. "The door's been forced," Lestrade said, standing in front of a small chamber with a polished threshold from much pacing. "Bolt got shot. There are no other entrances." The doctor from the division had a heart-like expression. "These foreign musicians run to nerves." Holmes did not respond. His long fingers floated above the broken bolt for a little period, much like a dowser's twig does above water. He smelled the air, looked up at the painted and closed transom, and stepped inside. It was a professional's modest den, a narrow table, a cheap mirror in one corner, pegs with a black frock and a grey cloak on them, a washstand with a ewer and glass, a small iron stove no larger than a hat box, and the dead man as described by Mr. Mullet, composed, the bow still in his right hand, the instrument across his knees, as if he had paused between phrases to consider a fingering. Death had shown him the politeness of neatness. There were no distortions. His thin and beautiful features had settled into a sombre rest that I have seen on the newly deceased when the flight was quick and the body had no chance to scream wrath. Holmes brushed my sleeve lightly. "Your opinion, Watson." I bent, listened, and allowed my gaze to travel over the little details that are as important to a physician as letters are to a reader. The skin lacked the dusky, congested hue of a strangled man, as well as the pinched nose and bluish earlobes of a slow suffocation. The lips were pallid, and when I opened a lid with reverence there was no sign of blood. There was a faint scent in the room, not the sour reek of coal gas, but rather a blend of lamp oil, size, and rosin. I saw nothing on the hands except the customary gloss, where the strings fret the player's fingers. However, on the left lower jaw, where a violin's chin rest would normally be found, there was a small discoloration, no more than a shadow of irritation, as if something had abraded or warmed the flesh. "Sudden failure," I explained, "but no apoplexy, nor are there obvious signs of asphyxiation. The heart may still be the villain." Holmes had placed the bow on the small table and was looking at the violin like a naturalist peering into an unfamiliar bloom. He carefully brought it to the light and sniffed the ebony chin rest. "A perfume would be too romantic," he said, "but there is a faint odor, neither floral nor culinary." "Observe the surface, Watson." I followed his fingertip. The glossy plane where the player's jaw would rest had a dullness in one crescent, like breath on a window. Holmes returned the instrument to the dead man's knees with a gentleness that was devoid of sentimentality and full of respect for a tool. He approached the washstand, dipped his fingertip into the water in the glass, withdrew it, and frowned. Warm, but not enough to be poured in the last quarter hour. Before continuing, he refreshed himself. "The ewer water is chilly. So this," he touched the glass, "is recent. Who brought it?" Lestrade made a note with a reluctant pencil. "We can ask the call boy. Currently," Holmes stated. "First, the paper Mr. Mullet mentioned. It lay on the dressing table, a sheet neatly ruled with violet staves, each measure bearing the symbol of rest." Holmes did not touch the inked side. He slid a blank score sheet from beneath, turned the silent music face down on it, and gathered the smallest amount of soot from the little stove's lip with the pad of his finger. He breathed on the underside of the page and shaded it in soft black, as if rubbing a coin. Across the inner fibers, faint, a few strokes came up, indentations of a hand that had written upon the leaf above. They were not notes, but letters, fragments, a V, a tall L, an A with a cramped tail, and then, Holmes's eyelids lowered, a slanted E. "Vale," he said quietly. Mr. Mullet started. "Miss Ada?" "She is a lady, Mr. Holmes." "A musical one," Holmes returned, without inflection. "And ladies are as subject to nouns as the rest of us." "It is not proof. It is a direction post. Doctor, your alcohol, if you please." I produced the little bottle I carry for instruments and cuts. Holmes moistened a corner of his handkerchief and, with the lightest of touches, wiped along the first string at the point where bow and string first embrace. He did the same for each string in turn and for a thumb's width of the bow hair near its middle. Then, seating himself upon the second chair, he set the instrument beneath his own jaw and drew the bow. The first note that answered was a ghost. No sound, only a sensation of friction. The second gave a faint whisper as of silk on silk. The third, after a further brisk rub, rose clean and true, and the room, which had had too much silence, remembered what a G can do upon a well-made violin. He replaced it, and there was the glint in his eye which I associate with the detection of a simple idea artfully buried. You see, Lestrade, there is nothing supernatural in a silence. Lay upon the strings a substance that deprives the hair of purchase, wax, oil, glycerin with a touch of soap, and the bow may travel with admirable theatrical effect while the audience attends to a miracle. The rehearsal would sing. The performance would not. A dab with the right solvent restores the friction, and with it the voice. Lestrade looked as one who sees a conjurer extract an egg from his own sleeve. And who dabbed your what-do-you-call-it on the strings? Not Mr. Petrescu, Holmes said, unless he desired to earn hissings instead of encores. When did this dressing-room stand empty between rehearsal and performance? Mr. Mullet, who had recovered a little of his managerial stiffness, answered promptly. After rehearsal at 6, the company cleared the stage for an acrobat troupe, whose manager had come about a booking. Petrescu remained to practice scales behind the curtain. At past, he came here to dress. I met him in the corridor and said the house was good. He nodded. I went to the front office. The corridor boy would have been at his post. Miss Vale warmed her voice in the green room from 7:15. Mr. Bloom and the orchestra took their places at 10 to the hour. Holmes turned his head a fraction. And the young bearer of the violin case, the Bayat? Always about, said Mullet with a helpless motion of the hands. Petrescu dismissed him before he went on. He was to return at the interval. I did not catch the lad's name. Holmes rose. His gaze made a brief circuit, the bolt, the transom, the stage dust upon the floor, the little fleck of putty on the window sash, the rosin cake whose topmost facet was too clean, as if a new plane had been broken off. He took up the bow again, and held its hair against the light. Note here, Watson, the hairs darkened for the breadth of a finger, and there the faintest gumminess. The sabotage was thorough but hurried. A careful hand would have dressed the entire ribbon. Lestrade's pencil was scraped. So we have a prank, malicious, I admit, but not murder. The man's heart sank from embarrassment. Holmes's mouth tilted. You would be simpler to persuade, my dear Inspector, if there hadn't been that crescent on the chin and that strange odor on the rest. A material was placed here. He touched the ebony that required the warmth and pressure of performance to pass through the skin. Mr. Petrescu continued with a painted, quiet, and ended with a painted death. Lestrade bristled. You are telling me poison, Mr. Holmes. I'm telling you that death and stillness came from a single hand, and that hand had access to both the stage and this chamber. We'll see if it wore a glove. He moved to the doorway. Send me your gas boy, Inspector, your conductor, your mezzo, your carpenter, and, if Providence is kind, the nameless boy who carried a master's case. While you fetch them, I'll introduce myself to the pavilion. The house itself frequently witnesses what men forget. We emerged onto the wing where the flies began their black architecture. Holmes paused at the proscenium and gazed out. The theatre, with its tiers, gold and velvet, yawned like a beast with soft breath. He walked to the footlights, placed his boot on the exact board where the violinist would have planted his own, and used his eye to measure the distance to the blue-lamped row. He stooped, and his gloved finger came away with a trace of powder finer than stage dust. Rosine, he said, but spread rather than fallen, a purposeful dressing to heighten the image of the stroke. Someone was insistent that the audience see a boosing, even if they couldn't hear it. The trick, therefore, required spectators. The death necessitated privacy. Our perpetrator orchestrated both. He straightened, and in the distance a small figure appeared and vanished, quick, distrustful, and barefoot. The boy, Holmes replied softly. Lestrade, will start with those who are the most easily scared. They remember the most. The figure had vanished into the wings as if the painted scenery had swallowed it, and Holmes, without raising his voice, directed Lestrade to keep his men at the exit. We moved cautiously into the darkness, where ropes and counterweights formed a network of vertical lines and iron pulleys. A heap of discarded flats reeked of glue and paint, and water dripped slowly into a tin bucket. Behind the tattered drop of a pastoral meadow, we discovered the boy crouched with his knees beneath his chin, barefoot, his dark hair tangled, and his eyes wide as if silence itself might devour him. Holmes crouched so that their gazes met. When it pleased him, he had a gentle art of disarming without comfort. He spoke in such a low tone that the ropes above barely moved. "You carried Mr. Petrescu's case." The boy nodded once, his lips parting but no sound came. "Your name?" "If you please," Holmes said. The lips shaped something, Ion. Perhaps Oryan, but the syllable was broken by fear. Holmes reached within his coat and produced a small silver coin which he balanced on his long fingers and let drop into the boy's palm. The hand closed, not greedily but with the relief of being acknowledged. "You shall keep that, Ion. Now tell me, did anyone touch the violin between rehearsal and the concert?" The boy's head jerked in a nod, then again in hesitation. He raised a hand and pointed not to the stage, but upwards, towards the gallery where the lamps hung. Holmes's eyes followed. "From above," he murmured. "Good. You did well to remember." The boy scrambled to his feet and darted down the passage as if a curtain call had summoned him. Lestrade swore under his breath, but Holmes only watched the darkness into which he fled. He will return. Children seldom keep secrets from themselves for long. We were recalled to the immediate business by the approach of voices. Mr. Itzhak Bloom, the conductor, arrived with Miss Ada Vale at his side, her cloak hastily thrown about her evening gown, and behind them the carpenter in his apron of nails. The little group bore that defensive air common to witnesses gathered before questioning, each attempting dignity, and yet glancing at the others with suspicion. Holmes invited them into the green room where the gas was turned high. He did not sit, nor did he question directly. Instead he paced, hands behind his back, and permitted their own anxiety to fill the silence. It was Bloom who spoke first, his accent heavy with the continent, his manner brisk to cover unease. "I tell the inspector, it is his heart. Petrescu, he is, how you say? Consumed inside. Such men, they burn too fast. He plays with too much spirit." Holmes paused in mid-stride. "Spirit does not lay wax upon a string, sir." Bloom's dark brows climbed. "Wax?" Holmes lifted the bow which he had kept with him, its hairs still faintly sticky, and held it out. "Explain this." The conductor took it, frowned, and shrugged helplessly. "It is sabotage, then. But by whom? We are all friends, all professionals. No one gains by humiliating him." Holmes's gaze turned upon Miss Vale. She had the face of a woman accustomed to attention, striking rather than pretty, with eyes like glass that showed everything except depth. She adjusted her cloak, as though to avoid the dust of the theatre's upholstery. "I admired Mr. Petrescu," she said coolly. "He was remote, yes, but an artist. If you suggest I scratched his strings like a jealous child, Mr. Holmes, then you mistake me." Holmes's expression altered not at all, but his glance flickered to me as if to remind that truth often lay not in words, but in the tremor of a hand upon its folds. I noted that her fingers, which clutched her cloak, were marked faintly with chalk, as from the rosin cake on the dressing table. "Miss Vale," Holmes said, "do you write music?" She hesitated only for a heartbeat, but it was enough. "No, I sing it." "Then you did not inscribe your name upon his manuscript?" Her composure fractured. "What nonsense! Why should I—" Holmes cut across her denial with a quiet firmness. "The indentations betray the hand. Whether from affection or from malice, you left it. That much is fact. What we must establish is whether you placed anything more than letters upon his page." Lestrade broke in impatiently. "If you've proof, Holmes, then by heaven produce it. I see nothing but a lady wrongfully accused." Holmes did not rise to the inspector's challenge. Instead, he turned suddenly upon the carpenter, who had been shifting from foot to foot like a man too long from his bench. "You forced the bolt." "Yes, sir." "You saw the body first?" "Aye." Sat quiet like you were thinking. "Only, well, the glass, the water glass." Holmes's head tilted. "What of it?" "Weren't there when I swept the stage at 6:30. I fetched him a fresh towel then, and there was no glass. Someone must have brought it after. Can't say who. I was back with the chisel when they called for the door." Holmes clasped his hands. The agent then entered while Petrescu was on stage. The glass gave the draught, while the chin rest delivered the poison. The silence on the strings was not an accident, but rather a prelude to the larger silence that would follow. He quickly turned to Lestrade. "Find the boy!" He noticed something above. "While you squander air, your villain slips his knots." The inspector scowled but issued the order. His men dispersed, their boots ringing along the flagged hallway. Holmes resumed his pacing, but I could see from the set of his shoulders that he was rotating the case on an axis that was invisible to everyone save himself. He paused at the piano in the corner, struck a chord and listened as if sound might conspire. He then spoke almost incoherently. The violinist's death was planned with precision. The strings were sabotaged, the others were poisoned, and water was used to speed absorption. But the intelligence that created this also desired spectacle. Silence in a music-filled hall. A dramatic irony that is too cruel for chance. Miss Vale tugged her cloak closer, and Bloom frowned at the floor. Mullet wrung his hands. Holmes lifted a finger, his tone becoming sharper. You all stood to lose or gain from Petrescu's reputation. One wanted his stillness more than his singing. The question is, who? The gaslight flickered in a draught, and I noticed the first tremble of terror pass Ada Vale's meticulously arranged features. Holmes noticed it too, but made no comment. Instead, he requested the orchestra list, each name written in Mullet's meticulous hand, and studied it with the same concentration he would give a cipher. Finally, he folded it into his pocket. Enough for tonight. The dead man awaits, but the truth does not decay. Tomorrow morning, Lestrade, we'll get answers from chemistry and the boy. Until then, defend your witnesses with the same jealousy that a miser guards his coins. For if I am correct, the hand that wrote silence on a stave may still attempt to compose another. The next morning broke with a dark and unsettling light, the fog thick on Baker Street, so that even the hansoms drove with muffled wheels, their drivers staring ahead as if through gauze. Holmes hadn't slept. I found him already at his chemical table, sleeves rolled and eyes bright, a little array of files and powders neatly placed with military precision. The violin's chin rest was carefully unscrewed from its mounting and lay beside him. He greeted me with a curt nod that indicated he was too preoccupied to waste syllables. "You see, Watson," he said finally, holding a glass slide to the light, "the faint bloom we saw on the ebony has yielded to treatment. A vegetable alkaloid, undoubtedly compounded for invisibility. I sense strychnia's bitterness, albeit reduced, as well as a tinge of aconite's caustic sting. Applied to the rest, warmed by the flesh and absorbed via the jaw. Ingenious and cowardly." I bent over the slide, which revealed little more than color and faint sediment. "Then it was murder, not failure of the heart." "Plainly," he replied. "The silence upon the strings was artifice, but the silence of the man was design. We deal with a mind capable of subtleties and of cruelty." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson announced Inspector Lestrade. The fellow entered with his usual blend of suspicion and deference, hat in hand, boots still wet from the streets. He wasted no time on courtesies. "We've got the boy, Holmes. Brought him in from Spitalfields. Slipped back home, but my men traced him. He's no more than 12. "Excellent," Holmes said. "And Miss Vale?" "Guarded in her lodgings. She's fit to take umbrage, I can tell you. Denies she wrote a stroke of her name. Swears she barely spoke to Petrescu outside rehearsal." Holmes smiled thinly. "The lady will forgive our disbelief." "And the boy?" Lestrade shrugged. "Frightened, clams up. Says he saw a figure lean down from the gallery, while Petrescu tuned, but when pressed he shakes like a leaf. You'll get little from him." "On the contrary," Holmes said, reaching for his coat. "Children remember best when they forget they are questioned. Come, Watson." We drove through the sullen morning to a little station room off Bishopsgate, where the boy sat upon a bench, hair falling into his eyes, his bare toes curled against the cold floor. A constable loomed nearby with unnecessary severity. Holmes dismissed him with a glance and sat beside the child, stretching his long legs as though in idleness. He took a notebook from his pocket, not to write in but to sketch. With a few deft strokes, he outlined the curve of a violin, the bow, the angle of a man at the footlights. The boy's gaze fixed upon it, fascination stirring behind his fear. "You saw him thus, Ion?" Holmes said quietly. "The bow moving, no sound, yes?" "Good, and above, what did you see?" The boy's finger darted to the page, drawing a crude square where the gallery would be. He hesitated, then scrawled the suggestion of a hand, something long and pale descending. Holmes turned the notebook so I could see. It was the bow itself the boy had drawn, or some stick-like thing, lowered stealthily. Holmes's brows lifted. Not a hand, but an object, he murmured. Something lowered from above. A brush, perhaps, dressed with our unguent touched to the strings in the instant before performance. That accords with his terror of pointing upward. The boy, emboldened, scratched another mark. 2 dots beside the hand shape. Eyes peering down, he whispered a syllable then, scarcely more than breath. Familiar. "A woman," Holmes translated. His gaze sharpened. So it was no ghostly hand but a woman's face above the lamps. "Hyacinth, you have helped more than you know." He pressed another coin into the boy's palm and rose. "Guard him, Lestrade. His memory is our clearest witness." Outside, the fog pressed like damp wool. Holmes drew me aside where no ears could trespass. "A woman in the gallery, Watson. Consider." Bloom was upon the rostrum, Mullet at the front office, the carpenter at his work. Only Miss Vale had liberty to roam. She could step above the stage under pretext of listening, slip the brush to the strings, retreat unseen. Her name upon the manuscript was no accident. And her motive? I asked. "That remains the missing string," Holmes said grimly. Petrescu lived ascetically, too little known for enemies. Yet jealousy in music is a sharper blade than in love. Let us see what Miss Vale conceals. We called at her lodgings in Bloomsbury, where Lestrade's men kept watch. She received us in a parlour of modest furnishings, her figure erect, her eyes cool though ringed with sleeplessness. Holmes did not waste time on preliminaries. He held up the notebook where the boy's drawing remained. A child describes what he saw. A woman above the stage with something in her hand. "How do you explain it, Miss Vale?" Her colour rose but quickly receded. The boy dreams. "I was in the green room. Mr. Bloom can attest." Holmes tilted his head. "Attest that you were there at 7. But between rehearsal and performance you had ample minutes. You could have ascended, prepared your silence and returned. Deny it and the weight grows heavier." Her composure faltered then. She rose, paced the narrow room, fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl. "If I confess to touching the strings, will you cease this persecution?" "I meant no harm." "Only to humble him." He treated the rest of us as insects, playing to the crowd's frenzy while we scraped for notice. I thought if he faltered, if the audience laughed, perhaps management would see he was not infallible. I never dreamt, never, that he would die. Holmes's gaze was cold but not without pity. Poison was upon that rest. Not wax nor oil, but a tincture calculated. "Did you apply it?" "No," she cried, genuine horror in her voice. "I only brushed Rosine to cloud his bow. A trick, nothing more. Murder. God help me, I had no hand in murder." Holmes looked at her attentively. "Then someone learned about your mischief and contributed their own. Another hand utilized your act as a curtain to conceal their plan. Who held such knowledge? Who came close enough to see you? Think carefully, Miss Vale. A single name could save your life." She raised a hand to her brow, her eyes closing tightly as if to conjure memories. Finally she muttered, "Bloom, he followed me once while I was lingering at rehearsal. He told me not to cross Petrescu. Perhaps he saw." Holmes shared a confident glance with me rather than speaking aloud. "Very good. You will be on alert, but your honesty tonight may work in your favor. Come, Watson. We have a conductor to question." As we went, the fog cleared and the bells of St. Clement's tolled the hour. Holmes moved quickly, his voice low but purposeful. "The lady admits to sabotage, but without poison. Her offense is minor. No, Watson, the genuine murderer was hiding behind her folly. Bloom's warning may have been more than just caution. It could have been possession of the very plan. Music leads more than just notes. It may even lead us to a killer." Holmes wasted little time tracing Bloom. The conductor had lodged at a good inn near Covent Garden, and we made our way there, the fog trailing behind us like smoke from a damp lamp. The innkeeper escorted us to a first-floor chamber, with faint, tentative and broken piano tones trickling down the stairway. Holmes signaled for stillness, and we paused at the door. Bloom was practicing a part at a painfully slow pace, repeating the same 4 bars until they sounded like thought fragments rather than music. Holmes tapped lightly. The notes abruptly halted. Bloom greeted us with weary civility, yet his eyes were guarded. He was a little immaculate man, his hair thinning and his hands long and precise, as if his body existed solely to carry the baton. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, What do I owe the honor to? Holmes sat down without being invited, his big form filling the inn-chair to the point that it seemed insufficient beneath him. He didn't smile. You have worked with Mr. Petrescu for how long? 3 years. He joined us in Vienna and then here. A genius, although a challenging one. You warned Miss Vale not to cross him. Bloom's fingers twitched on the piano lid, but he maintained his gaze on Holmes. She told you that, didn't she? Yes, I did warn her. Petrescu wielded influence. To resist him was to invite disaster. I wanted to protect her, yet you yourself did not fear him. Holmes asked. A shadow passed over Bloom's face. Do you fear him? I respected him. However, he was a dictator with his art. The cadence, phrasing, and soul must all be his. That irritates the conductor greatly. We exist to shape music. He would do it alone. Holmes leaned forwards. So galling, Mr. Bloom, that you might wish silence upon him. Bloom stiffened, pressing his hands firmly against the slick wood. I poison him? No, I would never go this low. However, you were present when Miss Vale brushed the strings. You followed her, and you were aware of her intervention. Only someone with the knowledge could take advantage of it. Mr. Bloom, you had both opportunity and motive. The conductor's breathing quickened. His denial was sharp, but not fast. I did saw her once near the gallery. I suspected she had tampered, but I did not reveal it to her. I hoped a little humiliation would soften his attitude. But poison, that's beyond me. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yet the poison was implanted. Consider, Watson, a chemical that necessitates preparation, secrecy, and precision. It was laid where only a skilled hand would have thought to place it. Not on the visible strings, but on the rest where the act of playing would ensure absorption. Who among our suspects understands both the mechanics of performance and the chemistry of effects? A conductor who oversees rehearsals and is intimately familiar with each soloist's quirks. Bloom rose abruptly, flushing his cheeks. This is monstrous. You manipulate facts to support your suspicions. Petrescu was a colleague, and while he irritated and diminished me, he did not kill me. That is absurd. Holmes rose as well, his height overpowering the shorter man. Then let us investigate absurdities. You alone had the authority to wander during rehearsal without being questioned. You could approach the changing rooms without drawing attention. Who better than the conductor to ensure that quiet coincided with death? Mr. Bloom, it was not random. It was staged, constructed. A performance within a performance. Bloom's lips parted, but no words emerged. He appeared obstinate and damaged, like a violin held too long against a tightening peg. Finally, he sunk back into his chair, putting his fingers against his eyes. You cannot prove it. Holmes's voice was gentle. Proof has numerous strings. The chemical trace, the boy's painting, the lady's statement, and the carpenter's glass. Each is feeble on its own, but when combined, they produce a chord that cannot be ignored. Mr. Bloom, confess, and save yourself the humiliation of being dragged from your chamber by Lestrade's men. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint clatter of tableware from below. Bloom lowered his hands, his expression pallid. I won't admit. I'll just say this. Genius is harsh. It crushes those around it. Petrescu would have devastated us all. Perhaps the world is lighter without him. Holmes's stare did not waver. Your words condemn you far more than mine could. Very good. Lestrade will take a bow. We left him shocked but unyielding. In the street, Holmes drew me in with his quick words. He avoids confession yet withholds it. He may yet attempt to flee or worse, suppress our witnesses. We must act quickly. Then you are certain he is the murderer? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed against the fog. Are you certain, Watson? No, however, conviction is becoming near. He was aware of Vale's actions, had animosity toward Petrescu, and possessed the necessary means. But one thing bothers me, the text of silence. Bloom did not handwrite that page. Its goal was symbolic and sarcastic, and Bloom, despite his vanity, is literal. There is another mind at work, one that desires both death and irony. As we approached Baker Street, Holmes paused, his key in the lock, and his face lit up with instant insight. Watson, think. The music of rests, bar after bar of silence. Who lives on pauses, timing, and vacant bars, filled with anticipation? The conductor, I announced. Holmes smiled grimly. Precisely. We'll see if Bloom uses his shadow alone or with someone else. Tonight we return to the pavilion. There is the answer. in the orchestra pit, in the heartbeat of quiet. By sunset, the fog had lifted, but London still seemed to hold the echoes of the unsettling hush that had fallen over the pavilion the previous night. Holmes and I arrived by cab, our lamps cutting narrow furrows through the darkness, and the theatre loomed out of the mist like a sleeping beast, its eyes a faint gleam of gas behind closed glass. Lestrade welcomed us at the stage door, his demeanour brisk yet weary, as if the case had already grown too heavy for his patience. He reported that Bloom remained free under monitoring, Miss Vale was guarded at her home, and the kid Ion was secure in police custody. Holmes nodded, his focus already shifted beyond the inspector's remarks. We entered the pavilion through its wings. The house was empty, the seats were shrouded in shadows, and the stage was barren except for a few abandoned props. Holmes descended into the orchestra pit with the firm footing of a man surveying a battlefield. He proceeded from music stand to music stand, pausing at each to listen for any residual echo. His fingertips wiped away resin crumbs, a pencil stub, and an ink-stained folded program. Finally, he came to a halt at the conductor's lectern, stooped down, his acute eyes drawn to the thin groove where the baton struck. He sketched a shred of crumpled paper that was nearly illegible. He stroked it on his leg, and I noticed it was part of a score, but the notes had been scratched out, leaving only empty bars. Another page of silence, Holmes said. It isn't Petrescu's hand, but the same conceit. Do you see, Watson? It was planted here just for Bloom to find. Our murderer creates not only a death, but also a performance inside a performance. An elaborate act of silence. Lestrade looked over his shoulder, unimpressed. Paper and ink don't prove anything, Holmes. I want a man in irons, not a riddle. Holmes rose, his expression sharpening with thought. And you will have him, Inspector. But the key is not in ink alone. Observe. The strands have the faint impression of a sharper nib than Bloom's. I'll compare it to Vale and Mullet's pens. But there's more. The junk smells vaguely like lamp oil. This means it was kept near the stage lights. We must question ourselves. Who lingers regularly among the lamps above? The gas boy, I announced immediately. Holmes tilted his head. Precisely. We've overlooked him in favor of more visible suspects, but he commands the lights and shadows, and he alone has the ability to move unseen above the stage. If the boy Ion saw a woman's face, it could have just been a play of light or a mask of intent. Lestrade grunted. You'd pin it on the stagehand? A lad who makes a few pennies turning valves. Holmes' response was quick. Inspector, stage machinery is the kingdom of the invisible. Those who work in the shadows may see more than any star on stage. Let's find this gas boy. We ascended a narrow stairway to the gallery, where the lamps hung like suspended suns, with pipes and valves snaking along the rafters. The air smelled like oil and burnt metal. Holmes's lantern scanned the room, illuminating a torn blanket in the corner, next to a coil of hose and a damaged tin cup. Clearly someone had slept there. Holmes bent to examine it, and his hand took out a little case no bigger than a snuff box. He opened it and found a brush stiff with residue, its bristles discolored, and the handle stained with something crystalline. Holmes lightly touched it with a glass rod before holding it to his nose. The very implement, he explained. The brush descended to the strings. And look, the handle carries the initials VP. This was Petrescu's personal Rosanne brush, stolen from his case. Our perpetrator has a sense of irony. At that moment, footsteps clattered up the stairs and a slender youth emerged, his face coated with soot. It was the gas boy himself, barely older than 16, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Lestrade grabbed his arm, but the youngster shouted out, I never meant to kill him, just to teach him. Holmes's voice sliced through the chaos, low and deliberate. You had tampered with the violin. You touched the strings to silence them. But someone else poisoned the rest. Who was it? The youth's chest heaved. I promise, sir, I did what Bloom told me. He handed me the brush and told me to coat the strings, while the master tuned. It simply stated that it would cause the bow to slip. I was not aware of poison. Lestrade shook him. You lie, boy! But Holmes raised a hand. No, he tells the truth enough. Bloom ordered him, utilizing the stagehand's anonymity to conceal his act. However, Bloom would not take the danger of detection on his own. Another person provided the tincture, someone who understood both chemistry and theater timing. Consider Watson, the impresario mullet. He was supposed to be only worried, despite having access to everything. He has rosin on his finger, recollect, and he maintains that is a habit. He orchestrated the entire situation, using Bloom's resentment and the boy's obedience as his tools. A sudden clarity struck me. Then Bloom is reduced to a pawn, his pride exploited. Vale provides a shield, and her mischief is convenient. The boy's a tool. Behind it all is Mullet. Holmes' eyes glittered. Exactly. A manager understands the stage better than the players on it. He arranges entrances, exits, and illusions. He staged this death with the accuracy of a show. And he alone had a purpose other than envy. Petrescu threatened to breach his contract and join another house. A disastrous loss. The youngster sagged in Lestrade's grip and sobbed. Holmes placed the brush back in the box and closed it. There's our proof, Inspector. Take the youngster as a witness, but the real arrest is coming. Mullet incorporated stillness into his program, and Petrescu's silence served as the conclusion. We dropped into the auditorium once more, and Holmes's stride was quick and unstoppable. The curtain of fog at the stage door seemed to tremble with the breath of revelation, and I sensed that the case, which had begun in mystery, was now nearing its conclusion. Even so, Holmes's expression was one of deep reserve, as if one more note remained to be played. The fog lingered on the streets as we left the pavilion, the youngster in Lestrade's custody, and Holmes silent beside me in the cab. His eyes were filled with a distant fire that I recognized, as if the case were an equation he had nearly balanced, but some elusive sign refused to fall into place. When we arrived at Mullet's house, a nice residence off Holborn, Lestrade had already summoned his men to stand watch. The impresario greeted us in his parlor, with an air of aggrieved astonishment, his dressing gown drawn tight and a bottle uncorked on the sideboard. He attempted indignation, but Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Mullet, you arranged the silent performance. The poisoned chin rest, the fabricated document, and the brush delivered to the gas boy were all part of your performance. It was theatre, but death served as the climax." Mullet paled but recovered with a brittle laugh. "Absurd. I contacted you first, Holmes. Why would I summon my own noose?" Holmes's voice was cold. "Because you feared that chance would reveal your identity before your curtain call." Arriving at Baker Street with shaky palms and stories of the supernatural led me down a rabbit hole of phantoms rather than facts. You hoped to see superstition where there was only calculation. Lestrade moved forward, but Mullet held out his hands as if to deter him. I refuted. Yes, I worried about Petrescu's whims. What manager wouldn't? He was unpredictable, arrogant, and a drain on money and patience. But murder? That's another world. Holmes took the small case with the stained brush out of his pocket. He set it on the table with the finality of a gavel. "This was found among the lamps. The boy swears you gave it to him. The initials on the handle are Petrescu's, taken from his own case. You created the illusion of failure, knowing that Bloom's resentment and Vale's mischief would make suitable masks. When silence fell, suspicion would scatter like sparks from a lamp. Only you remained hidden, pulling strings from the shadows." Mullet's face blanched and then turned a sickly red. His mouth opened and closed silently, as if he were the violinist he had silenced, performing a pantomime without a note. "Bloom," he muttered hoarsely at last. "This was Bloom's plan." I may have known about it, but he insisted. Holmes looked at him with something close to pity. "You may shuffle the score as you please, sir, but the melody betrays you. Bloom may have lent his grievance, Vale her vanity, the boy his unwitting hand. But the author of silence was you. The contract papers in your desk, unsigned by Petrescu, will prove the motive. You faced ruin if he left you, so you bound him to you in the only way you could, by ending him." Lestrade gave the signal and his men closed in. Mullet sagged into their grasp like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He muttered something half-coherent, fragments of excuses, of financial loss, of genius too costly to bear. They led him away, his protests dissolving into the night. When the door closed, the room seemed strangely hushed, as though the very air conspired to remind us of the crime. Holmes poured himself a measure from Mullet's decanter, regarded it and set it down untasted. He drew from his coat the manuscript page of Silent Rests and held it to the lamplight. "There lies the essence of the crime, Watson. Not merely greed or fear, but irony. Mullet was a man of theatre. He could not resist composing silence itself into his spectacle, mocking the very art he claimed to promote. We returned to Baker Street early dawn. The city awoke like a sleeper to distant bells. Holmes dropped into his chair, exhausted not by his body, but by a mind pulled taut on an overly fine wire. I dared to express what had disturbed me throughout the night. But Bloom too is guilty, Holmes. He directed the child to tamper with the strings. Without such, the overall design might have failed. Holmes clenched his fingers. True, Bloom behaved with a purpose to humiliate, not murder. He will answer for his part. But murder involves more than malice. It requires strategy. Bloom's foolishness was merely a note in the harmony, but Mullet directed the score. The law will determine the degrees. I nodded uncomfortably. The image of Petrescu, placid in death, with his violin across his knees, stayed with me. And Miss Vale? I asked. She too will stand before an inquiry, Holmes said. However, her remorse stems from vanity rather than venom. She will live to learn the harsh lesson that envy can be used to conceal more serious sins. For a while we sat in silence, the first thin strands of daylight winding across the carpet. Then Holmes spoke again, softly and almost to himself. It's strange, Watson, that quiet should reverberate louder than sound. Petrescu played nothing, but his final performance will be remembered more than any of his notes. Mullet's arrest and subsequent confession brought the investigation to an end, but he expressed it as a sorrow for a wasted career rather than guilt. Bloom was censured, Vale was expelled from the firm, and the kid Eon vanished back into the maze of Whitechapel, clutching the pennies Holmes had pushed into his palm. For London, the controversy was just another night of entertainment, a story to tell at clubs and coffee shops. For me, it was another reminder that evil can hide not only in the shadows of alleys, but also in the brilliant footlights of the stage. Holmes ignored it with trademark coolness as he reached for his violin that evening. The world is full of men who mistake applause for immortality, Watson. Petrescu wanted neither, but discovered both. Mullet sought both, but only found quiet, and with that he drew the bow. And the first actual note that flooded our sitting room felt more alive than any music I had ever heard. After so much artifice and death, in the days following Mullet's arrest, London's newspapers pounced on the story with pleasure, leaving little opportunity for nuance. "Murder in silence," shrieked one broadsheet, while another proclaimed Petrescu a martyr of talent dragged down by envy. The more ominous journals mentioned curses, foreign intrigues, and secret clubs of musicians. Holmes read them with his usual disdain, allowing the newsprint to fall to the hearth like spent ash. However, I could tell he was not completely satisfied. His demeanor was tense, as if he refused to put the topic to rest in his mind. As I arrived from a late call at a patient's house, I discovered him crouched over the same manuscript of Silent Rests, magnifying glass in hand, his pipe forgotten and cold. When I entered, he didn't glance up. "Watson," he replied, "tell me what strikes you about this page." I took it, observed the empty bars, the violet ink, and the precise rule. "It's mocking, Holmes, a composition of quiet, but beyond that I see little." He awoke, agitated, and walked before the fire. Mockery, yes, but not Mullet's. His hand was dramatic, his motive wealthy, but his thinking lacked the same accuracy. The nib's cut, the ink's hue, the exquisite flourish of the rests, they belonged to a skilled musician, not a man of contracts. I frowned. "Then you mean Mullet did not pen this at all?" "Precisely. He used poison, but someone else penned the script. Consider this, my dear fellow. The page was discovered in his dressing room and another scrap in the orchestra pit, both pointing to quiet as a motif. Mullet's vanity could not have conceived such a complex symbol. There is another player on the stage. I felt a chill. You suspect Bloom still?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Bloom or someone like him. The conductor feeds on relaxation and expectancy. As I previously stated, silence is not Petrescu's weapon. But why should Mullet suffer the burden of it? Why write the manuscript and then hide behind someone else's guilt? That, Watson, is the real riddle." Before I could respond, a rapid and persistent knock came from below. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his expression grave. "Holmes, the devil take it, but Mullet's dead. He hanged himself in his cell this morning." I left no note. Holmes simply tightened his jaw in response to the news. "Convenient," he replied. "It was too convenient. The deceased make wonderful scapegoats, Inspector." They don't answer any further queries. Lestrade appeared uncomfortable. You mean to say— I meant to say, Holmes interjected, that the curtain has not fallen. Someone placed those pages. Someone used Mallet as an instrument, and now guarantees he will not play again. If you're wise, you'll keep a careful check on Miss Vale and Bloom. Our murderer is still with them. Lestrade swore under his breath. I thought the case closed. The public may think so, Holmes said sharply, but truth will not bend to applause. Leave us now, Inspector. There's work to be done. When Lestrade left, Holmes looked to me with startling intensity. Do you remember the slight scent on the violin rest? Not entirely strychnia or aconite, but tinted with resin. That concoction required a hand with chemical knowledge beyond Mallet's ability. He was a showman, but not a chemist. Joe Watson, the poison was created somewhere, by someone who understood both music and combination. I considered. Bloom has the training in music, but chemistry, exactly so. Not in Bloom's schooling. However, recall the carpenter's remark. The glass of water appeared only after rehearsal, not before. Someone entered unobserved, bearing both glass and prepared. What if the person wanted to compose a death like a movement in a symphony? Holmes sunk into his chair, fingers pushed together. We need to return to the pavilion, Watson. There is still a note unplayed and a bar unfilled. Until we identify the genuine composer of Silence, Petrescu's Requiem stays unfinished. That night we traced our ways back to the theatre. The building remained dark and abandoned until the scandal faded. A constable at the entrance welcomed us, complaining about the folly of protecting empty wood and velvet. Holmes went through the wings with his light up, capturing every detail with his hawk's vision. He paused at the green-room piano, raised its lid, and played a single key. The tone resonated weirdly, muted as though cloth had been laid therein. He reached inside and pulled out a folded stack of paper, hiding among the strings. He spread it on the table. It was another manuscript, but unlike the others, it contained both notes and rests, forming a skeletal melody intermingled with stillness. At the bottom of the page, a prominent signature. I Bloom, I breathed. So he was the author, after all. Holmes' expression was unreadable. Yes and no. Look closer. The hand is Bloom's, but the ink is darker and fresher. This was composed after Petrescu died. A forgery or a confession? This is what we must learn. But one thing is certain, Bloom wanted quiet to be remembered as music, transforming absence into presence. He could not avoid returning to his theatre, even under suspicion, to bury this hideous score. He folded the pages delicately. Tomorrow we will confront Bloom, but, Watson, don't expect him to give up easy. Men who compose in silence are particularly protective of their secrets. And until his truth is revealed, Petrescu's bow continues its ghostly stroke. We left the pavilion as morning came pale over the city, and I could feel the air thick with anticipation, as if all of London was waiting for Holmes to play the final chord of this macabre symphony. The next morning, we paid Bloom a visit at his residence. He met us in the same chamber where Holmes had challenged him previously, but this time there was no pretense of courtesy. His face looked pale, his eyes red-rimmed, as if the weight of suspicion had hollowed him. The piano remained open, with the same piece partially scribbled in pencil on the score, but his hands hovered over the keys as if they no longer followed him. Holmes placed the folded sheet of music on the lid with deliberate calm. This, he explained, was found in the pavilion. Concealed within the piano, your signature is on it, Mr. Bloom. However, its existence condemns you more than any testimony. Bloom looked at the papers as if they were venomous. He finally murmured, I wrote it. Yes, but it's not as you think. There was no confession of murder. It was an elegy, my requiem for Victor. His quiet demanded form, so I gave it one. Holmes regarded him coldly. Elegy is an overly generous term. It is an obsession. Silence was transformed into music, an irony that matches the poisoned chin rest. You expect us to believe that you, who despise Petrescu's genius, wrote this after his death solely to honor him? No, sir. You wrote it because silence has always been your weapon. Bloom's tiny frame trembled. Weapon? You don't comprehend. He stole everything from me. The orchestra observed just him, and the critics only complimented him. I was invisible, as if the baton itself had become transparent. I wished for a moment when the audience would lean toward my hand instead of his. But I swear to you, Holmes, that I did not kill him. I wanted he was humbled, not destroyed. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. Yet he was destroyed. Mullet offered motive, but he lacked artistry. Vale interfered, but she lacked venom. The boy acted, but without intent. You, Bloom, had both artistry and resentment. You orchestrated silence. Bloom pushed his fists to his temples, shaking gently. No, you are looking for a villain, and I am a convenient choice. But if I were guilty, would I stay here in full view, composing elegies to reveal myself? Think, Holmes, would I not have fled? Holmes did not respond at once. He paced, the boards cracking under his heavy strides. You've asked a good question. Flight is not always a sign of guilt. It can sometimes indicate denial. However, it is your calligraphy rather than your appearance that draws me in. You chose silence as a theme, and the poison reflected it too accurately. There is symmetry here, Bloom. That is too beautiful to be coincidental. At that moment, a knock heard. A constable entered with a little parcel covered in brown paper, addressed to Bloom but intercepted following Lestrade's instructions. Holmes accepted it without ceremony and unwrapped it. Inside there was a bottle, stoppered and labelled in meticulous script. Aconitum diluted. It was accompanied with a folded note. For the next silent performance, Bloom recoiled as if struck. I've never seen that before. I swear it. Holmes inspected the label. The hand was delicate and exact, but not identical to Bloom's. Curious, he whispered. The same flourish on the letters as in Petrescu's manuscript, but not quite yours. Another hand is copying. He turned sharply. Bloom, who has access to your study, to your papers, to your ink? The conductor blinked in perplexity. When scores need to be transcribed, I only use my copyist, a young woman from the theatre named Miss Vale. And Mullet, who frequently searched my desk for accounts. However, he is no longer alive. Holmes's eyes glittered. Dead, and by a rope, strangely timed. What if his death was not a suicide, but rather another act of silence in his honor? A final note on the murderer's score? I felt the chill. The actual hand stays at liberty. Someone who utilizes both Bloom and Mullet as masks, who writes quiet yet never displays their face. Holmes nodded grimly. Exactly so. And who better than someone trusted to pass unobserved, replicate scores, and manage ink precisely? Vale? She admits to jealousy, but we underestimated her reach. Her name on Petrescu's book was not vanity. It was a signature. She fabricated Bloom's music, provided poison disguised as rosin, and set Mullet up for disaster. She composes in absence rather than with notes. Bloom's voice cracked into a gasp. Ada, impossible. She was ambitious, sure, but murder. Holmes turned on him with startling harshness. Ambition is a sharper motivator than talent. She lingered in your and Petrescu's shadows, and she sought the stage not just to sing but to rule. Silence was her aria. She made you the chorus and Mullet the scenery. And now she is preparing a second act. Without waiting for a response, Holmes walked to the door. Come, Watson. Lestrade should be warned. If we wait, Miss Vale might vanish or strike again. The actual composer of silence must be brought to speak. We left Bloom trembling beside his piano, the unfinished elegy spreading like a wound across the lid. Outside, the fog was lifting, and the midday bells rang across the rooftops. However, the air felt heavier than ever, as if London was holding its breath, waiting for the concluding chord of a symphony, written in stillness and death. We discovered Lestrade in his office, buried with reports and angry with interruptions. The inspector's objection was drowned out by Holmes's abrupt appearance, for there was a force about my friend's demeanor that allowed for no frivolousness. He presented Lestrade with the vial and the faked score, his voice sharp and anxious. Inspector, you must have Miss Vale secured immediately. She is not a bystander. She is the architect. Mullet and Bloom were her instruments, yet she wrote the entire story in quiet. If you hesitate, she will fade into the city fog as quickly as a note dies in the air. Lestrade blustered and partially rose from his chair. We've got her under surveillance, Holmes. She's harmless enough. Holmes, a singer with a shattered ego, sliced over him like a whip. A singer, sure, but also a copyist, proficient with ink, capable of copying so accurate that Bloom could barely deny his own hand. She placed poison on the chin rest with the same finesse as she placed silence on Petrescu's bars. Mullet, poor fool, was her shield. She left him open to suspicion before ensuring that his death left no questions unanswered. Don't you see? She is still conducting, and the orchestra has not stopped playing. The inspector swore, summoned 2 constables, and we were on our way to Vale's lodgings in minutes. The carriage lurched through the tight streets, Holmes silent beside me, his long fingers pounding an unknown cadence across his knee. Finally he spoke, his tone subdued and thoughtful. "She has performed the ideal cadenza, Watson. Layer upon layer of deception, a symphony of quiet. Yet even the cleverest musician must end upon a cadence. She has left us traces which will be resolved." We arrived to see the constables furious. The landlady, anxious and red-cheeked, wrung her hands as she recounted that Miss Vale had gone out an hour earlier, carrying a tiny travelling luggage. No destination had been suggested. The room upstairs was disorganized, with the wardrobe half empty, and the dressing table scattered with abandoned powders and stage rouge. On the washstand, there was an uncorked bottle with a harsh chemical aroma that made my eyes water. Holmes bent to sniff it, then touched a drop to his tongue with reckless assurance. "Veratrum," he answered. "A lethal potion if taken in excess, yet when diluted it masquerades as a tonic. Watson, she has freely carried her poisons disguised as medication. The theatre provided her with the ideal disguise. Cosmetics, concoctions, and elixirs were all readily available." Lestrade cursed and ordered his men fleeing in all directions, but Holmes did not move from the washstand. His gaze was drawn to a scrap of paper pinned to the looking-glass about the size of a calling card. Upon it, scrawled in Vale's forceful writing, was a single line of music, 3 bars of quiet, then a fermata, the symbol of a held pause. Under it the phrase "the final aria awaits." Holmes took it. "She plans to perform again, Inspector. Not on stage, but in the world. A final quiet that will cap her job. So where does ambition push her? To an audience larger than the pavilion. Iultram, to the city itself. We left quickly, and Holmes guided us unerringly to Covent Garden. Mark me, Watson. Tonight the Philharmonic will perform there, and Vale will not be able to resist. Her quiet will be heard loudest where sound is most expected, on the biggest stage, in the most packed house. We arrived at dusk, and the square was filled with carriages, torches, and the clamour of a stylish throng. The hall blazed with light, and the orchestra was already tuning within. Holmes proceeded with great determination, sneaking past staff with the authority of someone who belonged there. We were back in the wings with the familiar scent of rosin and lamp oil in the air. Lestrade stationed his men at each exit, but Holmes stayed vigilant, studying every shadow. The performance started. As the overture grew louder, I noticed the audience leaning forward. The strings rose in a sea of sound, the winds responded, and the brass declared. It was glorious, and yet behind it sat a tremble, the terror of quiet ready to drop. Holmes whispered, "She'll wait for the solo." That is when expectations are highest. Minutes dragged like hours. Then, in a quiet moment, Holmes stiffened. Across the stage, above the lamps, a slim, shrouded figure moved with purpose. Ida Vale. She leaned closer, holding a little brush that glinted softly in the light. Before Lestrade could react, Holmes sprung. He crossed the pit with incredible speed, grabbed the ladder, and ascended like a guy half his age. Vale turned, startled, and her face lit up completely. Not fear, but elation, as if she were about to deliver the note for which her life had prepared. Holmes grabbed her wrist. The brush dropped, clattering against the boards beneath. Her voice, quiet yet defiant, reached us. "You cannot keep mute, Mr. Holmes. It's already been written." Holmes dragged her down, unresisting yet proud, as if she had fulfilled her role regardless of capture. Lestrade's troops closed in, and the music paused before returning uncertainly. The audience, feeling nothing, applauded the continuance. Holmes handed her over to the inspector, making a final cold remark. "Miss Vale, you sought immortality via absence. However, the law will write your coda, not you." That night, back on Baker Street, he sat silently, violin resting on his knees. Finally, I asked, "Holmes, do you think she believed in her own madness, that silence was music?" He carefully drew the bow, and one long note filled the room as if it were breathing. "Belief, Watson, is the most hazardous score. She believed absence was more potent than presence. However, music does not exist in quiet, nor does brilliance in envy. It dwells only here." He squeezed the strings, and the note deepened, resonant, and true, where sound dares to exist. I looked at him and thought about Petrescu, Bloom's shaking hands, Mullet's damaged vanity, and Vale's furious eyes. A symphony of ambition and ruin culminates in a single prolonged tone. And when Holmes let it go, the silence that followed was no longer terrifying but peaceful. The trial that followed was brief, as the evidence against Ada Vale was both damning and peculiar. The falsified documents, the poisoned brush, and the bottle with its taunting inscription all spoke with a voice she couldn't ignore. Bloom testified unwillingly, confessing his role in encouraging the gas boy to tamper with the strings, but his guilt was one of pride and foolishness rather than murder. He was censured, shamed, and spared the gallows. Mullet, who had already died by his own or someone else's hand, became just another prop in her deceit drama. Vale herself stood in the dock with a poise that startled everyone who witnessed her. She neither sobbed nor denied, but when pressed to explain her conduct, she answered with chilling calm, "I wrote in silence what I could not sing in sound. The world would not hear me. Otherwise, it was as if she thought the court was an audience gathering for her farewell." Area Holmes attended one morning of the proceedings, more to confirm his deductions than for morbid curiosity. When the punishment was read, he turned away from the court without triumph, his face set in lines of tired certainty. Later in Baker Street, he told me that genius without humility is more deadly than ignorance armed with hatred. She attempted to command via absence, Watson, and in doing so created a void. The law has filled it with justice, but the echo of her ambition will stay for some time. Bloom, shattered and humbled, disappeared from London stages, fading into obscurity. Holmes gave Ion, the youngster whose scared memory had provided the initial thread, some tiny support in resuming more honest occupation. The controversy vanished from the city's appetite as swiftly as it had appeared, replaced by other outrages. But for Holmes and me, the case persisted. I discovered him with his violin again one evening several weeks later. He played quietly, a sorrowful tone that appeared to be both an elegy and a meditation. When the final note faded away, I quietly remarked, "You have given Petrescu his requiem, Holmes." He shakes his head. "No, Watson. Petrescu's requiem was composed in the solitude of death. What I play now is for those of us who are still alive. A reminder that music only exists where men are humble enough to let it live. Silence is unavoidable. Sound is a gift." And with that he lowered the bow, gazing into the fire with that distant expression that always appeared to extend beyond the Baker Street walls into some greater, unknown universe. For my part, I closed my notebook with a sensation that the case of the Whitechapel silent violinist had been not only solved but also completed. Its chords struck and echoes faded. Thus concluded one of our wildest adventures, an affair woven of pride, envy and silence that was finally settled by the clear voice of reason. And though the city quickly forgot, I knew I'd always remember the night when sound seemed to vanish and Holmes, using reasoning alone, restored it.